Sure, Fidel Castro was a dictator, but he also gave Cuba literacy, low infant mortality and a world-class healthcare system. So socialism worked in that regard, at least. Dead wrong. Castro's apologists conveniently forget that Cuba was a fairly well-developed country before the revolution of 1959. More so than the rest of Latin America, but in many ways more than Western Europe. Cuba had lower infant mortality rates than France and West Germany, and it had more doctors per capita than Great Britain. It's like the old joke about how you get a small fortune. Well, you start with a large one. It's not difficult to end up with literacy rates that's not so far from Spain's if you start with rates that are higher than Spain's. We're only impressed by data like that because it comes from a desperately poor country. So in a perverse way, we give Castro credit for ruining the Cuban economy. And of course, the dictatorship always manipulated statistics to hide the truth. But if you really want to know what Fidel himself thought of the healthcare system that he portrayed as world-leading, well, bear in mind that when he got sick, he flew in doctors and equipment from Spain. Free trade is for the rich and the big corporations. To help the poor, we have to rid ourselves of our free trade dogmas. Read my lips. That is dead wrong. The rich are different. They have more money, and that affects their consumer habits. If you have rich friends, you might have noticed that they don't seem overly excited by elastic fleece bottom pants for $6 or family pack diapers ultra absorbent at $17.57. They spend more on fancy apartments and expensive lawyers. The poor spend proportionally more on goods produced in other countries, and they are now available at everyday low prices thanks to free trade. This means that the inflation rate for the poor has been 6 percentage points lower than for the rich. One study showed that blocking free trade completely would reduce the purchasing power of the richest 10% of Americans by no more than 4%. They can afford it. But it would reduce the purchasing power of the poorest 10% by almost 70%. If you start a trade war, you start a war on the poor. We need unifying symbols and institutions in our increasingly diverse and globalized societies. So why not reintroduce the military draft, which was a melting pot for people from all backgrounds and where troubled kids were straightened out? Dead wrong. There are many problems with the draft. The most obvious is the one Ronald Reagan pointed out. Trying to defend freedom by forcing people to become soldiers undermines the very values that make our societies worth defending. But this argument of social cohesion is equally bad. A recent Swedish study showed that the draft increased differences between groups. Young men from high-income homes who served increased their incomes afterwards more than those who did not. Whereas kids from troubled homes and low-income households, they reduced their income more if they served. Because it delayed their introduction to the labor market. More of them became unemployed and committed crime. No big surprise there. Interrupting their education and undermining their job prospects made troubled kids more troubled. It's not exactly rocket grenade science. On election night, as Donald Trump triumphed, someone tweeted, "Maybe if we'd called more people racist in louder voices, this wouldn't be happening right now." Of course he was being ironic, but this sentiment is so dead wrong that we have to talk about it. Because there's reason to think that the identity politics of the left has contributed to the rise of the anti-immigrant populism of the right. If people read fabricated news stories about how different groups meet and integrate, they express more tolerant values afterwards. But if they read fabricated news stories about more diversity and more separation, they become more intolerant against minorities and they express more reactionary views in other policy areas as well. So if you want people to be more intolerant, you should talk about differences all the time. How groups are different from one another. how you can never understand a person from another group with other experiences. And if you think that your two cultures can meet, it's just cultural appropriation. And if you don't agree, you're a racist. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the postmodern left has done. Who sows identity wind shall reap identity storm. We have to talk about the elephant graph in the room. This famous graph looks like an elephant because it shows that all the world's poor and the very richest in rich countries increased their incomes a lot between 1988 and 2008. But look at the West's middle class. Nothing. They are the losers of globalization. Dead wrong. Graphs like these only look at relative income groups. They don't take into consideration that the composition of these groups change all the time. First, data from many poor countries were available only for later years, and their addition seems to drag down wages. Second, the population grows faster in poor countries than in rich countries, so the addition of more poor people gives them more space in every income group, which seems to drag down wages as well. Third, there was stagnation and even decline in some mature economies, like Japan's and former communist states, but that is not where the Western middle class lives. If we keep the selection of countries and population stable and only look at the Western middle class, their added income grows from the 0% in the elephant graph to 45%. It's the opposite of a Pyrrhic victory. One more loss like that and we win. Have you heard what's happened to capital in the 21st century? The rich get richer and they pass on their wealth to the next generation, so a new capitalist aristocracy is perpetuated. Well, that's dead wrong. A study from the Peterson Institute shows that the proportion of billionaires who inherit their wealth is not increasing, it's declining rapidly. In 1996, 45% of all billionaires were self-made. Today, 67% are. Inherited wealth has declined the most in the United States, where fewer than a third of all billionaires inherit their wealth today. Apparently, free markets and ruthless competition makes it possible for outsiders to beat incumbents. Europe, with all its protections, does worse. Here, more than half of all billionaires still inherit their wealth. Capitalism in the United States is ruthless to the rich. Wealth is created and lost at a nearly constant rate, so that the median fortune is roughly the same age today as it was in 2001. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, as the saying goes. Only now it's down to 2 generations. As leftist writer Naomi Klein puts it, global capitalism lapsed into its most savage form after 1990. All hope for progress and development was lost. The rich got richer, but the poor got poorer. But Klein is dead wrong. As a prolific writer puts it in a new book, never before in mankind's history have we seen anything like the social and economic progress that we've seen since 1990. Global GDP per capita has increased by almost as much during those 25 years as it did in the previous 25,000 years. Extreme poverty was reduced from 37% of the world population to less than 10%. Every minute that you listen to me, another 100 people rise out of poverty. The proportion of people who go hungry has been halved. Illiteracy has been more than halved, and so has child mortality. The proportion of countries that are democracies increased from 46 to 64%. If this is savage capitalism, then what the world needs right now is a double, with fries please. Trade destroys jobs, and the losers vote against it. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, you have to admit that support for him shows that there is something wrong with globalization. No, I don't. According to a Gallup study, Trump supporters are actually somewhat better off than other voters, even within the group of white voters, and they are no more likely to be unemployed. Contrary to all expectations, Trump support declines as a region's exposure to trade and immigration increases. As K. William Watson puts it, it seems like Trump supporters are opposed to trade and immigration not because they have had bad experiences with them, but because they have had very little experiences with them. So they only hear about it from the horror stories on the news, or from protectionists like Trump or Hillary Clinton in an election year. The US economy is about $1 trillion richer per year because of international trade. That's about $10,000 per household. The fact that voters turn to protectionism doesn't mean that there's something wrong with trade. It means that there is something wrong with the debate on trade. We stop ex-convicts from reoffending by getting them a job, so we need laws that ban employers from inquiring about criminal histories. It's especially important for African Americans, who are 5 times more likely to go to jail. Well-intended, but with dangerous unintended consequences. In fact, areas that introduce such laws have since seen proportionally fewer jobs for African Americans than those that did not. Why? Well, researchers tested this and sent out 15,000 fictitious job applications. Before such laws were introduced, white job seekers got 7% more callbacks than black job seekers. After such laws were passed, white job seekers got 45% more callbacks. Apparently, the more information employers get, the better it is for minorities. When information about applicants are withheld from employers, they act on generalizations and racial stereotypes. One study showed that when employers were stopped from checking credit records of applicants, they reduced the hiring of blacks by up to 1/6. These laws are well intended, but as Vikram Seth put it, God save us from people who mean well. It seems like ethnic groups cluster in their own areas and never ever meet with or understand each other. Segregation is on the rise. But surprisingly, that turns out to be dead wrong. Researchers have created a dissimilarity index to measure segregation, and this is much different from the "whatever I heard on the news that made me worried" index that we laymen commonly use. Instead, it looks at the proportion of a given ethnic group that would have to move out of their census tract to make them evenly spread out. And according to this index, 45 of the 52 big US metropolises with big black populations have become less segregated since 2000. In Britain we see the same thing. Since 2000, every ethnic minority has become less segregated. This is because of the most powerful force on earth: human beings' interest to lead a better life. They get a job, they make money, and they move to a better neighborhood. They fall in love, and love is colorblind. Almost 1/3 of new African American marriages are mixed race. We might stand in the way of this progress sometimes, with discrimination, with high minimum wage laws. But if we don't, it will continue. And then perhaps in the future, if we still talk about race relations at a boiling point, it's only because we still live in a kind of melting pot. The amount of money spent on US election campaigns seems to be growing all the time. And since the rich can spend more, they can buy our elections. Except they can't. Sure, the candidate who spends the most often wins. But research suggests that this is not because more money attracts votes. It's because the promising candidate attracts more money. One study looked at about 1,000 congressional races in the United States, where the same candidates faced each other in subsequent elections, but with varying amounts of cash at their disposal each time. And it seemed like money had a very limited effect. If a candidate doubled his war chest, it merely increased his turnout of votes by 1 percentage point. So it seems like candidates are inherently attractive to voters for some reason, perhaps because of their message or their ability to connect or even their physical appeal. And the donors, they just want to be on the winning team. So do the donors just waste all these money? No, there's the obvious risk that they buy some influence with the subsequent winner. But there is also a moderating effect. With all this money in circulation, it gets increasingly difficult for one single interest group to buy the whole election. NAFTA is the worst trade deal in history, and combined with China's entrance into the World Trade Organization, it has wiped out our manufacturing sector. Dead wrong. Granted, between 2000 and 2010, the share of manufacturing in total US employment declined by 0.4 percentage point annually. But you know what? That's exactly the same annual rate of decline that the US experienced between 1960 and 2000. Every country loses manufacturing jobs as they get richer, not because of trade, but because of a change in consumer spending and better technology. Even countries with large trade surpluses, like Germany and Sweden, see a loss of factory jobs at a similar rate. Because richer consumers, they spend less on stuff and more on healthcare, education, leisure, so people get employed in those sectors instead. But it doesn't mean that we are deindustrializing. American factories produce twice as much today as they did 30 years ago. It's only that all those machines make it possible for them to do it with fewer workers. So bringing the factories home won't bring the jobs back. It would only send prices higher. It seems like everything we buy is made in China these days. We import cheap goods, but we export good jobs. We should just produce everything we need locally and keep the factories and the jobs at home. Dead wrong. If we would really benefit from not buying from other countries, shouldn't we also stop buying from neighboring cities? And maybe your family shouldn't buy from other families. That would keep all the jobs home, right? And that is indeed the problem. You would have to do all the work yourself, including the jobs you're no good at. We produce the most when we specialize in what we do best. Importing from other countries has doubled our purchasing power, which has given us the money to buy other things, often from small local businesses. And as the Chinese get richer, they buy more of our exports. If you don't buy from other people, who's going to buy from you? We're energy-hungry monsters. We're thoughtless consumers and we waste way too much electricity. If we keep this up, the whole planet will suffer. And if developing countries copy us, it's a disaster, right? Dead wrong. In fact, electricity is essential for human development. It's essential for healthcare and transportation, for industry and agriculture. It's the difference between life and death. Villages in Bangladesh with electricity have a 35% lower infant mortality rate. In India, 8,000 children die out of 1 million born because their families don't have electricity. Many environmentalists think that these countries should go solar instead. It's a price worth paying, they say. But today, that price is being paid in human lives. $10 billion invested in natural gas could help raise 90 million people out of poverty and darkness, whereas the same sum spent on renewable sources would only help a third as many. The only thing worse than consuming too much electricity is consuming too little. In rich countries we buy more, we travel anywhere, and the planet pays the price. It's obvious that the richer we get, the more we damage the environment. Dead wrong. In the United States, the 6 leading air pollutants have been cut by more than 2/3 since 1980. London and New York are no longer the planet's most polluted places. Today cities like Beijing and New Delhi are, because wealth is a major determinant of environmental sustainability. because wealth gives you greener options. If you're poor, you might have to choose between your children's future and keeping a river clean, and that's not much of a choice. But wealth makes it possible to do both, and it gives you the technological tools to do it. Keeping the poor poor is not a way of saving the planet. It's a way of blocking their progress to a better and a cleaner future. As Indira Gandhi put it, poverty is the worst polluter. Trade is war. All against all, dog eat dog. Just look at the size of the trade deficit. Or look at the iPhone. Even that is now made in China. They're killing us on trade. Dead wrong. China can export so much because it imports a lot. And all of the valuable ideas, technologies and components that go into their export has been imported from other countries. An iPhone assembled in China and bought by an American adds perhaps $600 to the trade deficit. But only 20 of those dollars really go to China. Almost all of it go to workers and programmers, designers, marketers and tax authorities in the US and other Western countries. If you count only the specific value added by a country to their exports, the figures in China are about the same as those in America. Trade is not war. It is not conflict. It is voluntary cooperation. And so it only happens when both parties think that they benefit from it. Just like when we buy from our local grocery store. Even if we import a lot from them, they're not killing us. They're feeding us. Those who hope for a swift end to Cuban communism should be careful so that they don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, literally. Cuban infant mortality is famously low, lower even than in the United States. Not quite. This is an interesting example of how naive we often are when dealing with dictatorships. They want to give the impression that they can give people something that freedom can't. And many take their word for it, including the United Nations. But for starters, infant mortality was very low before the revolution was even a glint in Fidel Castro's eye, about a third of what it was in Spain at the time. How could they continue to make it go down even further? Well, by using smoke and mirrors. It turns out that late fetal deaths are abnormally high on Cuba, about 5 times higher than in countries like Spain and Sweden. So the regime systematically put infant deaths in the column of late fetal deaths, a column that no one bothers to look at. Adjusted for this, infant mortality is twice as high. But of course, Cubans who say this are jailed. So how can poor dictatorships consistently present impressive health data? Not having a free press helps. Free trade means that we buy the cheapest goods available, no matter how it's produced, even if it's produced by the cheapest labor, children. So you consume and another child suffers. Luckily, that's dead wrong. Think about your parents, or think about your children. What would ever make anyone put their children to work? Desperate need, probably. They put their children to work only if the families cannot survive without it. The moment they get by without it, they remove the children from the workforce. And when does that happen? Well, when there are better jobs and more trading opportunities for the adults. Research from countries like India and Vietnam show that as these countries opened up their economies, the extent of child labor was drastically reduced. The more a country engages in international trade, the smaller the extent of child labor. In the most globalized countries, child labor is disappearing altogether. The proportion of Asian children who work has been reduced by 90% since 1950. So you consume, and another child can go to school in the morning rather than to work. We are warming our planet with greenhouse gases, and that changes everything. We have to take drastic measures to dismantle industrial capitalism if we are to have any chance of survival. Dead and dangerously wrong. The biggest environmental threats are still the traditional ones, like a lack of clean water and sanitation. And indoor air pollution kills one person every 10th second, since they have to prepare food on open fires indoors because they don't have electricity or gas stoves. More wealth saves these lives. Sure, it also creates new environmental problems, but has within it the means to take care of those problems as well. If we have an annual economic growth rate of 2% per capita, then in 100 years from now we will be 8 times richer. The kind of resources and the science and technology we would then have at our disposal would make it possible to do things now seen as unimaginable, from using totally clean energy sources and adapting to warming, to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Sure, we should reduce greenhouse gases, but if our climate policies hurt our ability to create more wealth and bring power to the world's poor, then we are ridding the patient of the disease, but only by killing him. If the rest of the world wants women to rise to the top in business, you should do what we have done in Sweden and the other Nordic countries, with generous welfare states and egalitarian policies. Surprisingly wrong. We have a long tradition of gender equality in Nordic countries, but it seems like we in some ways are holding women back from the most important positions. The proportion of women amongst directors and chief executives is just 13% in Nordic countries, compared to 21% in Western Europe. The likelihood of women reaching managerial position is almost twice as large in the United States as it is in Nordic countries. Why? Well, public sector monopolies reduces the chances for women to start businesses, and very generous maternity leave means that many stay away from work life for a long time. Very high taxes makes it punishingly expensive to buy household services, so women have to juggle work, household and kids. There's nothing wrong with Nordic attitudes to equality, but it seems like there's something wrong with our welfare states. Isn't there something wrong with our modern individualistic culture? We all want more choices and more wealth, but then we get overwhelmed by all those choices, and more money doesn't contribute to our well-being because GDP cannot buy happiness. Dead wrong. It only looks like money has a diminishing effect on happiness because we look at dollars and cents, and another dollar when we already have much doesn't change our lives. When we look at proportional changes, we see another picture. Each doubling of per capita income is associated with a near 1-point increase in happiness on a 10-point scale. GDP per capita is strongly correlated to average happiness. Surveys since 1981 show that self-reported well-being has increased in 45 out of 52 countries. And the researchers say that this is because of economic development, more tolerance, and more freedom to choose. Granted, this civilization isn't the best of possible worlds, but from a well-being perspective, at least, it's the best we've had so far. It's been an awful financial crisis, but luckily central banks stepped in and saved the economy by flooding the markets with easy money. Now it won't happen again. I'm sorry to disappoint, but that's probably dead wrong. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises explained that governments can prop up the economy with artificially low interest rates. But those creates artificial booms, and unfortunately they have a tendency of collapsing. Ironically, the financial crisis that we're now trying to recover from was partly the result of easy money. It encouraged risk-taking and resulted in housing bubbles. Now we're doing it again. It punishes savers and rewards borrowers. It makes the markets much more risky by making safe income streams less rewarding and encourages people to take excessive risk to get any return on their capital. Even the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank's central bank, now warns that easy money inflates new bubbles in emerging markets, in real estate, in exotic securities, in government debt. Let's hope that this time is different, just like we hoped the last time. Genetically modified organisms are frankenfoods. This is a wild, dangerous experiment that should be stopped. At least we need labeling laws to warn people. Dead wrong. GMOs are the most tested products in agricultural history, and the result is already in, from experience and from experiments. Every respected institution that has looked at the evidence concludes that GMOs are not riskier than any conventional plant technique. And labeling laws would just give people the false impression that we should be worried about it. It would be like forcing companies to suddenly put labels on anything that includes ingredients that have been frozen or produced using artificial fertilizer. GMOs could save the world. It might end vitamin A deficiency. It might give us much bigger yields on less land, and so end world hunger, reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and save biological diversity. Sure, you can forego a meal if you think it's monstrous frankenfoods. Just look for a non-GMO label. But if you force the world's hungry to do the same, you are the monster. For years, the demand for low-skilled workers has been declining, and their wages have stagnated. Therefore, we need higher minimum wages to help them. Dead wrong. Minimum wage laws actually forces us to discriminate against people who have low skills. When the price of something rises, what do? Buy less of it, right? Well, when the price of workers rises, employers hire fewer workers. If demand for low-skilled workers has been reduced, you can help them by improving their skills, but not by banning them from working for the money employers are willing to pay. Now, economists cannot always document a correlation between minimum wages and unemployment. But that's because small increases, when times are good, only imitates what the markets would have done anyway. But much bigger minimum wage hikes are disastrous. If you think that increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour helps people, well, why don't we increase it to $30 an hour or $100 an hour? Yes, making ends meet with a minimum wage jobs is hard, but it's even harder without one. Massive leaks have revealed how the rich hide their money in tax havens. Therefore, they expose the greed and immorality at the heart of global capitalism. Dead wrong. In fact, it seems more like greedy government is being exposed. In the leaked Panama Papers, we find more political figures than Forbes billionaires, 5 times more. The documents read like a who's who of kleptocrats from countries like Russia and China and Iraq, and includes enough Middle East royalty to fill a palace. The more power officials have, the more they grab. And that tells us something about the benefits of tax havens. Entrepreneurs who create value for all of us by creating new goods and services and technologies are at the mercy of such governments. That they have at least a chance of going somewhere where taxes are lower restrains the greed of governments. We all react to high taxes. Some stop investing and taking risks altogether. Perhaps it's better that some continue doing so, but register elsewhere. Countries with stronger rule of law and lower taxes have fewer tax fugitives. As the 19th century economist Frederick Bastiat put it, the surest way to have the laws respected is to make the laws respectable. The world's 62 richest individuals own more than the world's 3.5 billion poorest combined. Surely the big problem in our world is inequality, and the only way to help the poor is to take from the rich. Dead wrong. The big problem in the world is not inequality, it's poverty. You know, my young daughter has a total fortune of, I'd say, $15. In fact, that makes her richer than the world's poorest 2 billion people combined. That sounds absurd, but that's because those 2 billion people have no monetary assets whatsoever. And that is the problem. If we distributed the assets of the 62 richest individuals to the world's poorest half, they would get only $500 each. That would only increase their income by 20%, and only for 1 year. The only way to sustainably reduce poverty is to invest in future productivity and wealth. And interestingly, that only happens in the countries that allows poor individuals with great ideas to become super rich. The problem in the world is not that my daughter has $15 or that she will become even richer in the future or that some become super rich. The problem is that so many people are still desperately poor. The middle class is being squeezed. US wages have not increased since the 1970s. If we had only slowed down the pace of technological progress and exposed our companies to less foreign competition, we would all have benefited. Dead wrong. It's true that blue-collar wages have not increased since the 1970s if you discount non-wage benefits. But that debate about wage stagnation ignores purchasing power, what money can buy. And that's really what we're interested in, if wages are supposed to be something more than just a number to impress our friends with. And the benefit of trade, competition and technological change is that it increases that buying power. For example, in 1979, it took 75 hours of work to afford a refrigerator. Today, it takes no more than 36 hours, and that refrigerator is also much better and consumes only a third of the energy it did. And in the same terms, the cost of a TV set, a vacuum cleaner, a coffee maker or a toaster is now 80% lower than it was in the late 1970s. To make our paychecks go even further, we need more trade, competition and technological progress, not less. I live in one of the best countries on the planet, Sweden. We tax and we spend and we have a huge government. And we're one of the world's richest countries. You should be more like us. Dead wrong. Sweden got rich first, with free trade and an open economy before we had the big government. In 1950, Sweden was already one of the world's richest countries. And back then, taxes were lower in Sweden than in the United States. Only then did we start expanding the government dramatically. And you know what happened then? We started losing. From having been the fourth richest country in the world in 1970, 25 years later, we were only the 14th richest. And no new jobs had been created in the private sector. It all ended in a terrible crisis. Since then, Sweden has become successful again, but only after a new reform period, with more deregulation and free trade than in other countries, with lower taxes, school vouchers and partial privatization of the pension system. Sure, Sweden is great. I love it here. But be careful so that you imitate the stuff that brought us wealth and not the stuff that almost brought us ruin. The clothes we wear condemn millions to a life of working in a sweatshop in countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh. Isn't it embarrassing that we walk around in fancy clothes produced by poor people, working long hours for almost no money? Shouldn't we all be ashamed? Dead wrong. In fact, sweatshops are stepping stones out of poverty, with much higher wages and better working conditions than the alternatives. And these exploitative factories provide new knowledge and technologies, which help create new local companies and industries. It's easy to show pictures of desperately poor people in Cambodia and Bangladesh, but few countries have made their rapid progress in the last decade. In fact, The number of extremely poor in Bangladesh has been reduced from 44 to 26 million, and poverty in Cambodia has been cut in half. If you wear clothes produced by poor people, wear them with pride. You helped reduce poverty and hunger. Don't give me that Merry Christmas. Humbug. I'm not a Christian. Saying Merry Christmas is insensitive. It's cultural imperialism. Dead wrong. Christmas started as a pagan midwinter festival where the Roman tradition of gift-giving became popular throughout Europe, and eventually so did the worshipping of trees. This celebration was so popular that the Christian Church turned it into the celebration of the birth of Jesus. Santa Claus was originally a blend of two different characters. The Tomte of Scandinavian folklore, a tiny and somewhat angry protector of the farm with a long white beard and sometimes a red cap. And the charitable Saint Nicolaus of present-day Turkey. The Dutch called him Sinterklaas, and the immigrants, they brought him to America, where his name was changed to Santa Claus. There he also got his traditional red garb in the ads of Coca-Cola in the 1930s. Christmas is a celebration of joy that every culture turns into its own with some unique additions. Saying that Merry Christmas offends non-Christians is like saying that putting up a Christmas tree offends non-pagans.